Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're standing on the edge of a cliff. Not a physical one, but a historical one.
Right.
We're looking at a moment in time where the history of an entire continent, and really, by extension, the whole geopolitical map of the modern world came down to, well, a margin of error measured in hours.
It really is one of those scenarios where you just have to strip away all the hindsight. It's so easy for us to look at a map of the world. You know, we see Australia, we see the English-speaking cities, the British legal system, and we just assume it was inevitable.
That it was destiny.
Exactly, that it was all destiny. But when you actually, when you open the logs and the secret admiralty orders from the late 18th century, you realize the whole thing was a massive panicked gamble.
A gamble that almost didn't pay off. I mean, to set the scene for everyone, it is January 24th, 1788. We're in Botany Bay. The British First Fleet, led by Arthur Phillip, has just arrived after an 8-month voyage from hell, and they are miserable.
Oh, completely. The water's scarce, the soil is all sand, the convicts are, restless, and the flies are apparently eating them alive.
Right. They're realizing that Captain Cook's glowing description of this place as a paradise was, frankly, a bit of a marketing exaggeration.
It was a disaster zone, basically. Philip is already thinking, we can't stay here, we are going to starve. But then, just then, the script completely flips.
The ship's on the horizon.
Exactly. On the morning of January 24th, the British lookouts spot sails. And not just any sails. These are two massive, pristine frigates flying the fleur-de-lis. It's the French Navy.
Led by the Comte de La Pérouse.
Yes, led by La Pérouse.
I just want to dwell on that image for a second.
Yeah.
You have this first contact between European superpowers on the absolute other side of the planet.
It's incredible.
The British had been there for barely a week. I mean, if they had been delayed by a storm off the Cape of Good Hope, or, if they had spent 3 more days arguing about logistics in Portsmouth.
La Pérouse would have been the one dropping anchor first. It is the ultimate sliding doors moment. Because he wasn't just passing through, he had orders. And if the wind had just blown a little bit differently, the history of the entire southern hemisphere shifts from an Anglosphere story to a francophone one, or perhaps something else entirely.
And that is the mission for today. We are asking, what if the First Fleet never arrived? Or what if they arrived just that little bit too late? And we aren't just writing fan fiction here, are we? We're taking a whole stack of counterfactual analyses, geopolitical reports from the era, legal essays, to really stress test the reality we live in.
We call this the Great Counterfactual. And by removing that single event, the British arrival, from the timeline, you can actually start to see the hidden mechanics of how modern Australia works.
What do you mean by that, the hidden mechanics?
Well, the legal structures, the ecological damage, the strategic alliances. It reveals just how fragile all of those structures actually are, how contingent they were on that one single moment.
Okay, so let's start with the motivation. Why were the British there in such a rush? I think the common story we all learn is that London's prisons were full and they needed a dumping ground.
Right.
But the sources suggest it was a lot more complicated and a lot more desperate than just prison overflow.
The prison overflow was the symptom, but the cause was the American Revolution. You have to remember the context of 1783. Britain has just lost the American colonies.
Right.
This is a huge psychological trauma for the empire, but practically, it's a sanitation crisis. For decades, the British justice system relied on shipping convicts to Virginia and Maryland. Suddenly, the United States exists, and they say no more.
But the British courts didn't just stop sentencing people to transportation.
No, of course not. The bloody code was still in full swing. I mean, you could be transported for stealing a loaf of bread. So the jails, they just fill up instantly. To cope, the government starts buying these old, rotting warships, they called them the hulks, and mooring them in the Thames.
Then they just stuff them with convicts.
They stuff them with convicts. And the descriptions and the sources of these hulks they're just nightmare fuel. We're talking about typhus, cholera, starvation.
Bodies literally piling up in the river that runs through the capital city.
It was a humanitarian disaster and a total public relations nightmare. There was this thing called the Penitentiary Act of 1779, which was supposed to build these new hard labor prisons, but the government was broke and, famously slow.
They couldn't build them fast enough.
Not nearly fast enough. So they started looking elsewhere. They actually looked at Africa first. There was a very serious proposal to send the convicts to Das Voltas Bay in what is now Namibia.
I read the survey report for that. It was actually a death sentence, wasn't
It
it?
was. The survey team came back and said it was too dry, the coast was too treacherous, and importantly, the local populations were too powerful to just displace. So Africa is off the table. By process of elimination, the finger moves across the map to New Holland.
To Australia.
But, and this is the absolute key point, if it was just about convicts, the British bureaucracy was famous for dithering. They would have debated it for another 10 years. They needed a kick.
And this is where we get into the spy thriller part of the story. Because the thing that actually launched the fleet wasn't just the overcrowding, it was intelligence.
Right. So enter Sir Joseph Banks. He's the famous botanist who sailed with Cook years earlier. He's the government's go-to expert on the region. And then enter Thomas Jefferson.
It's just wild to think of Thomas Jefferson being involved in the founding of Australia.
Well, at this time, Jefferson is the American minister in Paris, and he's keeping a very, very close eye on the European powers. He gets wind that Louis XVI is fitting out this massive expedition under La Perouse. Now, the official story from the French court is that this is purely a scientific mission, botany, astronomy, that sort of thing.
That Jefferson is suspicious.
Jefferson is deeply suspicious. He gets intel, specifically through an American Marine and adventurer named John Ledyard, that La Perouse has secret orders.
Secret orders for what?
He is to investigate the southern continent for the viability of a settlement. Jefferson passes this implied threat down the line, and it eventually reaches Banks and the Home Office in London.
And the logic here is, if the French set up a base in Botany Bay, they threaten the incredibly lucrative trade routes to China.
Exactly. It's all about tea and spices. The East India Company basically holds the purse strings of the empire at this point. If the French have a naval base in the Tasman Sea, they can raid British shipping at will.
So the whole mission changes.
It transforms. The decision to send the First Fleet transforms from a prison solution into a preemptive strike. This explains the brazen dash.
It really was a dash, wasn't it? I mean, the preparation of the First Fleet sounds absolutely chaotic.
It was a scramble. They were buying supplies that were already rotting. The ammunition didn't fit the muskets. They didn't have enough fresh water casks. They launched that fleet in 1787, not because they were ready, but because they were terrified the French would beat them to it.
So let's slide that door. Let's say that intelligence never reaches Banks. Or let's say the fleet gets battered by a storm in the Southern Ocean and has to limp back to Rio. La Perouse sails into Botany Bay on January 24, 1788, and the beach is empty. No British. What happens next?
Well, the first thing is, La Perouse was physically there. That's a fact. He stayed for 6 weeks, even with the British there.
Right.
So if the British aren't there, he likely stays even longer. He surveys the area. And here's the crucial variable. Botany Bay is actually a terrible harbor. It's too shallow, too exposed, but just a few miles north.
Is Port Jackson Sydney Harbor?
The very same, which Captain Cook had seen but hadn't investigated deeply.
He kind of kept it quiet, didn't he?
He kept it relatively quiet. He named it but didn't map it extensively in the published journals. It was almost like a secret prize he was keeping up his sleeve. So, if La Perouse sails 10 miles north and finds one of the deepest, safest natural harbors in the entire world, he is absolutely planting a flag.
And so we get Nouvelle-Galles du Sud, a French Australia. But there is a massive complication looming on the horizon for the French, too. The year is 1788.
The year before the world explodes. The French Revolution kicks off in July 1789. So you have to imagine a fledgling French colony, 6 months sail from home, suddenly and completely cut off.
Their king is executed, the Republic is declared.
Right. That sounds like a recipe for total chaos on the ground. You'd have royalist officers commanding revolutionary sailors. Supplies would stop coming from France. The colony would be orphaned, essentially.
And historically, when French colonies were isolated like that during the Napoleonic Wars,
the British tended to swoop in and take them.
like they did with Mauritius, for example.
Exactly like Mauritius.
Yeah.
Or the Cape of Good Hope, which they took from the Dutch. So one very, very likely scenario is that we get a French foundation, but the British conquer it 20 years later. But even in that scenario, the DNA of the country has changed forever.
How so? I mean, if the British take it over anyway, doesn't it just kind of revert to what we know?
Not necessarily. You just have to look at Quebec in Canada. The British conquered New France, but Quebec retained its language, its religion, and its legal system.
Okay, that's a great point.
In this French foundation scenario, Australia might have started with the code Napoleon civil law rather than British common law.
Let's just unpack that difference because it sounds really technical, but it affects everyday life in profound ways.
It really does. British common law is built on precedent. It sort of evolves based on what judges decide in previous cases. It's fluid. French civil law, on the other hand, is codified. It's based on a strict written rule book. It tends to be more centralized.
So the whole style of government would be different.
Completely. A French colonial administration would have been more military-focused, more bureaucratic, more top-down.
And the religion would be Catholic from the start.
From day one. In our real timeline, the Irish convicts they were marginalized for a century because of their Catholicism. In this timeline, the Catholic Church is the establishment. You'd see cathedrals and town squares designed in a French style, not the Georgian brick barracks we actually got.
So we have the French distracted by revolution. They're vulnerable. But they weren't the only players in the region. The Dutch had been bumping into the west coast of Australia for nearly 200 years at this point. They called it New Holland. Why, in all these scenarios, do we assume the Dutch wouldn't just take it?
This brings us to, I think, a really key point. The economic incentive, or the lack of one. We have to understand the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. They weren't an empire in the traditional sense. They were a corporation.
Right. Think of them as Amazon or Google with a private navy.
That's a perfect analogy. Their primary directive was shareholder profit, full stop.
And Australia just wasn't profitable enough for them.
They looked at the West Coast, which is, arid, rocky, and incredibly harsh, and they just saw red ink. There is a famous line from a Dutch captain in the 1600s after surveying the coast. He wrote, "There is no gold, and the people do not use pepper."
No spices, no gold, no deal. It's that simple.
Precisely. The VOC wanted high-value trade items, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, things they could ship back to Europe for massive markups. Or they wanted to trade with sophisticated civilizations like China or Japan. They looked at the Indigenous Australians, who were hunter-gatherers with no accumulated material wealth to trade, and they just decided there was no business model there.
Plus, just physically getting there was a nightmare for them.
The navigation was treacherous. The Dutch used the Roaring Forties, these incredibly powerful westerly winds, to rocket across the Indian Ocean to Indonesia. Now, to hit Australia, you had to turn left. If you turned too late, or if your navigation was off by just a little bit,
you smash into the cliffs of Western Australia.
Exactly. The coast is littered with Dutch shipwrecks, famous ones like the Batavia and the Zuiddorp. For the Dutch, Australia was a navigational hazard to be avoided, not a prize to be won.
There's also the labor question. The British had a resource the Dutch didn't have.
The convicts. This is the crucial economic differentiator. The British could force thousands of men to build roads, wharves, and buildings for the cost of cheap rations. It was a massive state-subsidized labor force.
And the Dutch didn't have that system.
No, the Dutch did not have a penal transportation system. If they wanted to build a colony in the harsh environment of Western Australia, they would have had to import slaves.
And by the late 18th century, the economics of slavery were starting to shift.
Yes, it was becoming more expensive and, in Europe at least, politically controversial. Setting up a brand new slave colony from scratch in a place with no water and no cash crop just didn't make sense on a VOC balance sheet.
So without the British arrival, the West Coast likely remains New Holland on the map, a vague claim, but physically empty of Europeans for much, much longer.
That seems the most likely outcome.
Okay, so the Dutch are counting their pennies, the French are fighting their revolution. This leaves the continent open for the people who were actually there all along, the Indigenous Australians.
And this, for me, is the most profound part of the great counterfactual. We have to talk about the legal doctrine of terra nullius.
Nobody's land.
Nobody's land. This was the legal fiction the British used to claim the entire continent, right? They said because there were no fences, no stone houses, no farms as they understood them, the land wasn't owned.
It was a convenient blindness, really. They didn't see agriculture in a way they recognized, so they just declared the land empty and took it without any negotiation.
And the question is, would another power have done differently? Or maybe a better question, if the British had arrived later, would they have done differently?
The sources mention that Arthur Phillip, the first governor, actually had instructions that implied a treaty was expected.
He did. His instructions from King George were to conciliate the affections of the natives and live in amity. It didn't explicitly say sign a treaty, but the precedent was there. The British had signed treaties in North America. They negotiated in India.
So why not in Australia?
Well, in Sydney, Philip was under siege by the elements. He was starving. He was scared. He was culturally arrogant. He basically skipped the diplomacy and went straight to occupation.
But if we delay the arrival, If the British don't come until, say, the 1830s.
The entire global mood changes. By the 1830s and 40s, the anti-slavery movement in London is incredibly powerful. The humanitarian movement is pushing for indigenous rights across the empire. In 1840, the British signed the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand, which recognized Maori sovereignty.
So if Australia is colonized on the New Zealand timeline, we might have seen a treaty here as well.
It is highly, highly probable, and that changes the entire legal architecture of the nation. I mean, in our reality, Australia didn't recognize native title until the Mabo High Court decision in 1992.
That's 2 centuries of legal erasure.
2 centuries. If you have a treaty from day one, you establish what is called a domestic-dependent nation model.
Can you explain that concept? Domestic-dependent nation. What does that mean in practice?
It's a term that comes from U.S. law, established by Chief Justice John Marshall in the early 19th century. It essentially means that indigenous tribes are distinct political societies. They are subject to the federal government in some ways, but they retain the title to their land unless they formally and willingly sell it. They are a nation within a nation.
So the starting point of the conversation isn't, we own this now, it's, we want this piece of land, can we buy it from you?
Exactly. Now, it doesn't mean colonization doesn't happen. It certainly doesn't mean there isn't violence or coercion. But the legal foundation is negotiation, not total theft. And that would have prevented the specific, deep foundational wound that Australia is still trying to heal today.
There's another fascinating element to this indigenous story in the sources, the so-called real First Fleet, the one that was coming from the north.
The Macassans, yes. We have to shatter this idea that 1788 was first contact. For at least a century, probably longer, before the British arrived, fleets of praus, these wooden sailing ships, were coming down from Makassar in modern-day Indonesia to the Northern Territory.
But they weren't colonizing. They were trading, which is a key difference.
A crucial difference. They were there for business. They wanted trepang sea cucumbers, which were a luxury food in China. They would camp on the beaches of Arnhem Land for a few months, process the trepang, and trade with the local Yolngu people.
And they paid for the access.
They paid for the right to fish. They introduced metal axes, cloth, tobacco, alcohol. Things were exchanged.
And language, too, I read.
Yes, there are hundreds of Macassan loanwords in the indigenous languages of the North. They developed a working pidgin language to communicate. This was a functional international trade relationship.
So in our no British fleet scenario, what happens to this connection? Does it just continue?
It probably explodes. In our timeline, the British eventually shut this trade down in the late 19th century because they wanted to control the borders and, collect taxes. But without that interference, that trade network likely intensifies. You can imagine indigenous maritime polities developing in the north, perhaps even acquiring their own ships and integrating fully into the Southeast Asian trade network.
That is a mind-bending image. An Australia that faces north. Not a European outpost looking back at London, but a Pacific player fully integrated with the archipelago to its north.
It suggests that indigenous societies weren't static. They weren't just waiting. They were adapting to the global market long before Phillip showed up. If left alone, we might have seen trading cities rise in the North Darwin, not as a colonial fort, but as a Macassan-Yolngu trade hub.
Okay, let's zoom out again, back to the big geopolitical map, segment 5, the partitioned continent. Because if the British don't grab the whole continent in one go, you have to assume someone else is going to grab a piece.
It's almost inevitable. We call this the scramble for Australia. In our timeline, Britain claimed the East in 1788. Then, purely because they were paranoid about the French sniffing around, they claimed the West in 1829. And just like that, they colored the whole map pink.
But if they delay, the map fragments.
The map fragments. And you end up with a border.
Where does that border sit?
The most likely place is the 129th meridian east. That's the current border between Western Australia and the rest of the country. In a counterfactual world, that line becomes a proper international frontier.
So west of the line is New Holland, maybe a Dutch protectorate, or maybe the Germans grab it later in the 19th century like they did with New Guinea.
Possibly. And east of the line is British, and maybe Tasmania Van Diemen's Land could be French as a consolation prize.
It sounds like the Balkans of the South Pacific.
It would be a geopolitical nightmare. In our timeline, the Australian colonies federated in 1901 to become one nation. That was hard enough when they were all British. Now imagine if they were speaking 3 different languages, using 3 different currencies, and have 3 different legal systems. Federation becomes impossible.
So instead of one Australia, we have 3 or 4 medium-sized countries all sharing the same landmass.
Correct. And that brings us to the terrifying military implication. The sources discuss a very specific scenario regarding the Second World War.
The Vichy French scenario.
Exactly. Imagine it's 1940. France falls to Nazi Germany. The French colonies Indochina, parts of Africa, become Vichy French. They are technically neutral, but in reality, they're collaborating with the Axis powers.
So Tasmania is a French colony in 1940.
Then Hobart becomes a Vichy port. Japanese submarines could potentially dock there to refuel, to rearm.
That completely breaks the entire Allied defense strategy for the Pacific.
It absolutely destroys the concept of the island wall. The British and the Americans relied on Australia being a unified, friendly, massive base. It was the unsinkable aircraft carrier for General MacArthur. If the continent is fractured, if there are hostile or neutral zones within it, the logistics of the Pacific War collapse.
The Japanese might have been able to isolate the East Coast entirely.
It's a very real possibility. It just emphasizes how much we take the unity of the continent for granted. It was a strategic anomaly.
A quiet continent, as the historian Douglas Pike called it.
Right. But in this scenario, it is anything but quiet. It's a major zone of conflict.
We've talked about borders, laws, and wars. But there was a silent victim in the arrival of the First Fleet that we really need to discuss. Which brings us to segment 6, the ecological what if.
Yes, this is the biological invasion. The arrival of the First Fleet wasn't just a political event, it was an ecological cataclysm. Australia had been biologically isolated for millions of years.
Let's talk about hooves. It seems like such a minor detail, but the sources really harp on it.
It is the fundamental clash. The Australian landscape is ancient. The soil is old, weathered, and incredibly fragile. The native animals, kangaroos, wallabies, wombats, have soft feet or pads. They move across the land without breaking the surface.
And the First Fleet brought sheep, cattle, horses.
Hard hooves.
They act like tillers, just churn up the soil.
Exactly. They smash the crust of the soil. Then when the rains come, the topsoil just washes away. You get massive erosion, the silting of rivers, and eventually dust bowls. But the livestock were just the heavy machinery. The real biological weapons were the pests they brought with them.
Rabbits and cats.
The infamous rabbits and cats. European rabbits were introduced for sport, for hunting. They multiplied exponentially. They eat the seedlings of native trees, effectively stopping the forests from regenerating. And the feral cats.
The numbers are staggering.
They are. The sources estimate they kill millions of native animals every single night.
The number I saw was 6 million animals per night. That is hard to even comprehend.
It is an ecological massacre on an industrial scale. Australia has the highest rate of mammal extinction in the world over the last 200 years. 39 species. Gone. Forever.
Wow.
Now, in our counterfactual, if the First Fleet never arrives, or if colonization is limited to small coastal trading posts like the Dutch might have built, that interior ecosystem remains largely intact.
So the greater bilby, the western quail, all these animals that are just hanging on by a thread today.
They would likely still be abundant across the continent.
Yeah.
And we have to talk about fire. This is so crucial for understanding modern Australia. Indigenous people practiced what's called fire stick farming.
Mosaic burning, right?
Right. Small, controlled, low-intensity burns to clear underbrush and encourage new grass for hunting. It creates a mosaic of burnt and unburnt patches. When the British arrived, they saw fire as a threat, something to be suppressed at all costs.
So the fuel load just builds up and up.
For 200 years, the forests get thicker and denser with dry fuel. Then, when a fire inevitably starts, from lightning or arson, it's not a managed burn. It's a megafire, a firestorm. The Black Summer fires we see today are a direct result of disrupting that Indigenous management system.
It's a catastrophic management failure.
It is. In a timeline where Indigenous sovereignty persists, that management continues. The landscape looks radically, and I think healthier, different.
It's a haunting image. A greener, quieter Australia.
Ugh.
It brings us to the conclusion of our deep dives today. We've looked at the French, the Dutch, the treaties that never were, the wars that might have been, and the land itself. When you stack all of this up, what is the core takeaway for you?
For me, the takeaway is the fragility of the present. We walk around our cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and they feel solid.
Yeah.
Concrete, steel, glass, we assume they had to be here. But the research just shows they didn't. They are the result of a margin of error measured in days and a favorable wind.
It's the ultimate butterfly effect. Jefferson talks to a spy in a Parisian salon, the wind blows east instead of west off the Cape, and suddenly the continent is speaking French. Or it's a patchwork of warring nations.
Or it's a strong Indigenous trading power connected to Asia. The great counterfactual forces us to confront what many people call the foundational wound of Australia, the lack of a treaty.
Hmm.
Recognizing that the British arrival was a chaotic, panicked scramble rather than some divine destiny makes it easier to look at the present and ask, is it too late to fix that initial mistake?
And that's the debate that's happening right now in Australia with things like the Voice to Parliament and the Makarrata Commission.
Exactly. Those are all attempts to go back to that moment in 1788, that missed opportunity where Governor Phillip failed to follow the spirit of his instructions and to try and retrofit a solution. We are still, more than 200 years later, trying to resolve the chaos of the First Fleet's arrival.
I want to leave the listener with that image we talked about earlier, the moccasin prows sailing down from Indonesia.
It's the most hopeful image for me. It represents a relationship with the world that was reciprocal. It was trade, not conquest. It was exchange, not erasure. It's a glimpse of a future that was cut short, but maybe, just maybe, it offers a model for how Australia can engage with its region in the Asian century.
It has been a fascinating journey through the timeline that never was. Thank you for helping us navigate all these sliding doors.
It's a pleasure. History is a map, but sometimes you have to look at the blank spaces to really understand the borders.
And to you, the listener, keep looking at those margins. The real story is often in the footnotes. We'll see you on the next deep dive.